World War I, from the American perspective, World War I, known at the time as the Great War, began in Europe in 1914 as a devastating conflict among the major powers of the Old World. For the United States, however, the war initially appeared distant, and most Americans hoped to remain neutral and avoid entanglement in European rivalries. Yet by 1917, the United States entered the war, and in doing so, it reshaped both the conflict's outcome and its own role in world affairs. From the American perspective, World War I was a turning point. It tested the nation's ideals, transformed its economy and society, and marked its emergence as a global power. American Neutrality, 1914-1917. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson declared that the United States would remain neutral in thought as well as in action. Many Americans agreed the country had a strong tradition of avoiding permanent alliances, rooted in George Washington's warnings about foreign entanglements. The United States was also a land of immigrants with ties to both sides. Millions of German and Irish Americans were wary of supporting Britain, while others with roots in Britain and France sympathized with the Allies. Neutrality, however, did not mean isolation from the effects of war. American industry and agriculture quickly became vital suppliers to the Allied powers, especially Britain and France. U.S. banks extended large loans to the Allies, deepening economic ties. At the same time, Britain's naval blockade restricted American trade with Germany, causing diplomatic tensions, but not enough to push the United States into war. What steadily eroded American neutrality was Germany's use of submarine warfare. In 1915, the German sinking of the British liner Lusitania, which killed 128 Americans, shocked public opinion. Germany temporarily moderated its submarine campaign to avoid drawing the United States into the war, but mutual distrust grew. Wilson tried to position the United States as a mediator for a peace without victory, yet the fighting only intensified. By 1917, several developments pushed the United States from neutrality to intervention. The critical issue was Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917, attacking all ships, including those from neutral countries, entering designated war zones around Britain. This policy threatened American ships, commerce, and lives directly. The revelation of the Zimmerman telegram further inflamed American opinion. In this secret message, intercepted and decoded by the British, Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico if the United States entered the war, suggesting Mexico could recover lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When this became public, many Americans saw it as a direct threat to national security. German submarine attacks soon sunk several American ships. Combined with growing economic ties to the Allies and a sense that German militarism endangered international order, these attacks persuaded Wilson and Congress that neutrality was no longer tenable. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, portraying the conflict as a struggle to make the world safe for democracy. Congress approved, and the United States formally entered the war on April 6, 1917. From the American perspective, entering the war meant an enormous effort to mobilize military manpower, industry, and public opinion in a short period. In 1917, the U.S. Army was relatively small compared to those of European powers. To build a large fighting force, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, instituting a draft that ultimately called millions of men into service. The government also reorganized the economy for war. Agencies like the War Industries Board coordinated production of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The Food Administration encouraged increased agricultural output and voluntary conservation at home, so more food could be shipped to the Allies. The Fuel Administration promoted coal and oil conservation. War bonds and Liberty loans financed the massive costs of mobilization, while taxes also increased. American society underwent significant changes. Women moved into jobs traditionally held by men, particularly in factories and offices to support the war effort. African Americans participated in the Great Migration, moving from the rural South to northern cities to fill industrial jobs, reshaping American demographics and race relations. At the same time, civil liberties were curtailed, the Espionage and Sedition Acts limited dissent, and critics of the war faced surveillance, arrest, or social hostility. Likewise, the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe. The American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, commanded by General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France in mid-1917. At first, American units were small in number and required training and equipment. Pershing insisted that U.S. troops fight as an independent American army rather than simply serving as replacements under British or French command. This insistence reflected a desire to ensure the United States had a distinct role and voice in both the war and the peace that would follow. By 1918, American forces were deployed in large numbers. U.S. troops participated in key battles that stopped the last major German offensives and then helped drive the Germans back. The Second Battle of the Marne, the Saint-Mihiel offensive, and especially the Meuse-Argonne offensive saw heavy American involvement. The Meuse-Argonne operation, launched in September 1918, became the largest single campaign in U.S. military history up to that time, involving more than 1 million American soldiers. For many American soldiers, the war was a brutal introduction to modern industrial warfare. Machine guns, artillery barrages, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes transformed the battlefield. American casualties were significant. Tens of thousands killed and many more wounded, though far lower than those suffered by European nations that had been fighting since 1914. The presence of fresh American troops and abundant U.S. supplies helped tip the balance against an exhausted Germany. The war at home, society and culture. American participation in World War I reshaped society and culture. Government propaganda promoted unity and patriotism. The Committee on Public Information used posters, pamphlets, films, and speeches to encourage support for the war, sometimes fueling suspicion toward German Americans and immigrants. Many German-language newspapers closed. German-language instruction declined, and some communities renamed German-sounding streets or foods. For women, the war opened opportunities and strengthened arguments for political rights. Their contributions to the war effort as nurses, factory workers, clerks, and volunteers gained public recognition. This momentum contributed to the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote nationwide. African Americans also saw the war as a potential path to greater equality. About 350,000 African Americans served in the armed forces, often in segregated units, and frequently assigned to labor roles rather than combat. Some units, such as the 369th Infantry Regiment, Harlem Hellfighters, fought bravely under French command and earned distinguished honors. However, discrimination persisted at home and in the military. The contrast between fighting for democracy abroad and facing racism and violence in the United States fueled new resolve among African American leaders and communities to demand civil rights in the post-war era. By the autumn of 1918, the combined pressure of Allied offensives, internal unrest, and economic strain pushed Germany to seek an armistice. On November 11, 1918, the fighting ended. For Americans, news of the armistice sparked massive celebrations, relief, and pride in having helped bring the war to a close. President Wilson quickly turned to shaping the peace. In his 14-point speech earlier in 1918, he had outlined his vision for a post-war order based on self-determination, open diplomacy, free trade, and collective security through a League of Nations. Many Americans embraced Wilson's idealistic rhetoric, seeing the war as an opportunity to create a more just and peaceful international system. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Wilson was one of the big four Allied leaders. He pushed for inclusion of the League of Nations in the peace treaty and for principles like national self-determination. However, European leaders such as Georges Clemenceau of France and David Lloyd George of Britain prioritized punishing Germany and securing reparations and territorial gains, having borne the brunt of the war's destruction. The resulting Treaty of Versailles reflected compromises and contradictions. It created the League of Nations, redrew borders, and imposed heavy penalties and territorial losses on Germany. From the American perspective, Wilson had achieved some of his goals, but faced intense opposition at home. Seventh, the American debate over the treaty and isolationism. When Wilson returned to the United States, he encountered resistance from the Senate, especially from Republican leaders who criticized the League of Nations covenant. They feared that membership might limit American sovereignty and drag the country into future foreign wars without congressional approval. The Senate's debates over the treaty reflected deeper questions about America's role in the world. Should the United States commit to global collective security or return to a more traditional stance of avoiding entangling alliances? Many Americans were weary of war and skeptical of European politics. Despite Wilson's nationwide speaking tour to rally support, the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. As a result, the United States never joined the League of Nations and instead negotiated a separate peace treaty with Germany. This outcome shaped American foreign policy in the interwar years, pushing it toward a more isolationist stance even as its economic and cultural influence abroad grew. From the American perspective, World War I had profound and lasting consequences. Politically, it marked the country's arrival as a major world power whose troops and resources were decisive in ending the war. Yet the rejection of the League of Nations revealed the tension between global leadership and domestic wariness about international commitments. Economically, the war accelerated U.S. industrial growth and shifted the financial center of the world from London to New York. The United States emerged as a major creditor nation, and American companies expanded their global reach. Socially, the war transformed the roles of women and African Americans, contributing to movements for suffrage and civil rights. The Great Migration altered the demographic and cultural landscape of American cities. Veterans returned with new expectations and traumas influencing literature, art, and public attitudes. The war also helped fuel sentiments that would later produce both the exuberance of the 1920s and the disillusionment that shaped American memory of the conflict. Culturally, many American writers and thinkers who experienced the war firsthand or witnessed its effects expressed a sense of disillusionment with old ideals. The lost generation of writers, including figures like Ernest Hemingway, who served as an ambulance driver in Italy, captured the emotional and psychological impact of war and its aftermath. World War I, viewed from the American perspective, was much more than a temporary intervention in a distant conflict. It was a watershed moment that forced the United States to grapple with its identity as both a republic founded on ideals of liberty and a rising global power drawn into international affairs. The war ended with American troops helping to secure victory, but the peace that followed revealed the limits of U.S. influence and the complexity of translating ideals into lasting order. And for many Americans, the Great War remained an ambiguous chapter, neither clearly a good war like World War II, nor simply a tragic mistake. Yet its impact on American politics, society, and international role was undeniable. It set patterns of engagement and reluctance, of idealism and realism that would shape U.S. responses to global crises throughout the 20th century and beyond. It set patterns of engagement and reluctance, of idealism and realism that would shape U.S. responses to global crises throughout the 20th century and beyond.